The heat in Dry Hollow was a living thing. It rose from the baked earth in shimmering waves, settled in the dust that was as fine and soft as flour, and clung to the splintered wood storefronts like a shroud. In the late summer of 1878, the sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the town until it seemed all the color had been bleached away, leaving only shades of brown and bone white. The sky was a vast, empty blue, offering no promise of rain, no hope of relief. This was a place built on grit and desperation, a stop for men with more ambition than sense, and women who had learned that survival was a currency paid for in silence. Law was a suggestion, whispered by a sheriff who spent most of his days nursing a warm beer in the saloon, and justice was whatever the man with the quickest hand decided it was. Hope was a weed that withered before it could take root. Into this crucible of dust and despair, Clara Sutton was delivered. She was 19, with a face that might have been beautiful had it ever known a reason to smile, and eyes the color of a twilight sky that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. Her father, Elias Sutton, was a man hollowed out by whiskey and regret, a prospector whose luck had run dry years ago, leaving him with nothing but a daughter and a mounting pile of debts. His latest, a gambling loss he could not cover, was owed to a man who held a different kind of power in Dry Hollow. Reverend Josiah Tull was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. He was past 50, with a face full of sharp angles and deep lines, and a voice that could boom with the threat of hellfire from the pulpit of his modest church. He spoke of sin and damnation as if they were his personal acquaintances, and the townspeople, starved for any kind of certainty, listened with a mixture of fear and reverence. But behind the righteous facade, in the quiet of the small parsonage behind the church, another spirit moved him. It came from a bottle, and it twisted his piety into a venomous rage. He was a man of God in the light, and a creature of base appetites in the shadows. And it was to this man that Elias Sutton sold his only child. Clara learned of her fate on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the smell of dust and manure, and the buzzing of flies was the only music in their small, dilapidated cabin. Her father could not meet her gaze. He stared at a crack in the wooden floor as he spoke, his words slurring together. "The Reverend is a good man. Clara, a respected man. He will provide for you. It is a good match." She did not cry. The tears had dried up long ago. She simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, a silent, still figure against the grimy wall. She knew what this was. It was not a match. It was a transaction. She was the coin used to settle a debt, a piece of property changing hands. She had watched her father gamble away their food, their last few decent possessions, and finally, his own dignity. Now, he had gambled her away, too. The silence in the room stretched until it was thin and brittle. When she finally spoke, her voice was a near whisper, devoid of emotion. "When?" "Sunday," her father mumbled, and finally risked a glance at her. What he saw in her calm, empty eyes made him look away again. A flicker of shame stirring in the fog of his mind. "He wishes to be married before the congregation, to set an example." The wedding was a public spectacle, just as the Reverend had intended. Clara stood beside him at the front of the crude church. The townsfolk packed into the pews behind her. They were not there to celebrate. They were there to witness. She wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple white cotton garment that was now a size too large for her slender frame. The hem was stained with the ever-present dust of Dry Hollow, a smudge of brown against the tired white. Her face was pale, her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, their gazes a physical weight. She could hear the whispers, the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted to get a better view of the lamb being led to slaughter. Reverend Tull's hand was a heavy, possessive weight on her arm. His voice, usually so full of fire, was unctuous and smooth as he recited the vows. He spoke of union, of holy matrimony, of a wife's duty to her husband. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the life she might have had. When it was her turn to speak, the words would not come. The silence stretched, and she could feel the Reverend's grip tighten, his fingers digging into her flesh. "I will," she finally whispered, the sound swallowed by the cavernous silence of the church. He slid a thin gold band onto her finger. It felt cold and heavy. A manacle. The life that followed was a blur of gray monotony, punctuated by moments of sharp, terrifying color. Her days were measured by chores and sermons. She rose before the sun to fetch water from the town well, the long walk her only reprieve. The wooden buckets were heavy, and the yoke bit into her shoulders. But the solitude of the pre-dawn quiet was a balm. In those moments, with the sky turning from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, she could almost pretend she was someone else, somewhere else. But the parsonage always loomed at the end of the path, a constant reminder of her prison. Inside, her life was a performance of servitude. She cooked and cleaned, mended his clothes, and endured his sermons, which he practiced on her at the dinner table. He would thunder about the wickedness of women, the temptations of the flesh, his eyes boring into her, making her feel as though Eve's sin was her own personal inheritance. He shamed her in public with a pious concern that fooled everyone. He would speak to the storekeeper of his wife's fragile sensibilities, or tell the blacksmith's wife that he was praying for Clara's silent, melancholic nature. The town saw a holy man burdened with a difficult wife. They did not see the man behind closed doors. In private, his cruelty was a physical thing. It came after the whiskey had soured his soul, turning his righteous anger into a foul, personal rage. His hand was quick to strike, his words even quicker. He called her useless, barren, a temptress sent to test his mortal soul. The abuse was methodical, almost ritualistic. He never marked her face, always choosing places that would be covered by her high-necked, long-sleeved dresses. A dark bloom of a bruise on her ribs, a painful ache in her shoulder, the stinging welt across her back. She learned to read the signs of an impending storm, the sour smell of drink on his breath, the way his jaw tightened, the cold, flat look in his eyes. When she saw it coming, she would retreat into herself, making her body small and her spirit even smaller, waiting for it to pass. The women of the town whispered when she passed them in the street. They saw the new thinness of her frame, the dark circles that had taken up permanent residence beneath her eyes, the way she flinched if someone moved too quickly. They saw it, and they looked away. It was not their business. A man's home was his castle, and what happened between a husband and wife was a matter for them and God. Clara was the preacher's wife, and that made her something other, an object of pity and suspicion, but not of compassion. Her only real comfort was the silence. When the Reverend left the parsonage in the evenings, seeking the company of the bottle he kept hidden or the backroom card games he publicly condemned, the small house would fall quiet. In those precious hours, Clara could breathe. She would sit by the window, not looking out at the dusty street, but up at the vast, star-dusted sky. She remembered her mother telling her that the stars were holes in the floor of heaven, letting the light shine through. She wondered if her mother could see her now, and the thought was a fresh ache in her chest. She did not pray for rescue. She had forgotten how. She simply prayed for the silence to last a little longer. One night, the storm broke with a violence she had not yet seen. The Reverend had been gone for hours, and he returned in a state of drunken fury. He had lost heavily at cards, and his humiliation had curdled into a vicious poison that he was determined to spit at her. He burst through the door, his face a mask of rage, his eyes wild. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers like a vice, and dragged her from the house. "You!" he roared, his voice carrying across the quiet town square. "You are the devil in my house, the serpent in my garden!" She stumbled behind him, her bare feet scraping against the rough, stony ground. The night air was cool, but she felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. He hauled her into the center of the square, directly in the pale moonlight. Windows in the surrounding buildings began to glow with lamplight. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in the shadows, drawn by the commotion. "Look at her!" Tull bellowed, shaking her so hard her head snapped back. "She tempts good men to sin with her silence. She fills my home with a wicked spirit. I preach the word of God, and I come home to a den of iniquity." His accusations made no sense. The ramblings of a drunken mind searching for a target. But the townspeople gathered, a silent, watching circle. They were miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and their wives, the same people who sat in his church on Sundays. Their faces were a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a grim sort of satisfaction. They were watching a drama unfold, a break in the crushing monotony of their lives. Clara stood frozen, her thin nightgown doing little to shield her from the chill or the dozens of staring eyes. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sickening. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She looked from face to face in the crowd, a desperate, silent plea in her eyes. She saw pity in some, but in most, she saw nothing. They were just spectators. Tull raised his hand, the moonlight glinting on the silver ring he wore. "I will beat the devil out of you, woman," he snarled. The blow came fast and hard, a flat, open-handed strike across her cheek that sent a burst of light and pain through her head. She staggered, a small cry escaping her lips. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath, but no one moved. He hit her again, and she fell to her knees in the dust. The world swam before her eyes. Through the haze of pain, she was aware of his looming form, his hand raised for another strike. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm settling over her. This is how it ends. Then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the saloon. A figure moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was at odds with the chaotic scene. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in the dust of a long ride. He wore worn leather and carried himself with an unnerving stillness. He walked into the circle of moonlight, his boots making no sound in the thick dust, and stopped directly in front of the preacher. The Reverend, blinded by his rage, did not seem to notice him at first. He was still shouting at Clara, his spittle flying. "You will learn to respect your husband. You will learn the fear of God." The stranger did not say a word. He simply stepped forward and, with a movement that was both shockingly fast and brutally efficient, he struck the preacher. It was not a wild swing, but a short, powerful blow to the jaw. The sound of it, a sickening crack, echoed in the sudden, dead silence of the square. Reverend Josiah Tull crumpled to the ground like a discarded puppet, unconscious before he hit the dirt. The crowd was frozen, stunned into immobility. The stranger paid them no mind. He turned his attention to Clara, who was still on her knees, staring up at him. She could not make out his features clearly in the dim light. Only the strong line of his jaw and the shadow of a hat pulled low over his eyes. Then he knelt, and for a brief moment, she saw his eyes. They were calm, unblinking, and held a depth of quiet intensity she had never seen before. They were not filled with pity or anger, but with a simple, steady resolve. He reached out, his hands large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. She swayed, and he steadied her, his arm a solid presence around her waist. Without a word, he led her toward his horse, a big, dark animal that stood patiently at the edge of the square. The crowd parted before them, a silent, fearful sea. He lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, his hands spanning her waist. Then he swung up behind her, his body a warm, solid shield at her back. He gathered the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, urged the horse forward. They moved out of the town square, leaving the stunned crowd and the unconscious preacher behind. They rode into the vast, dark expanse of the plains, the rhythmic hoofbeats of the horse a steady drum against the silence of the night. The lights of Dry Hollow dwindled behind them until they were just a faint, hazy glow. And then they were gone, swallowed by the immense, star-filled darkness. Clara leaned back against the solid warmth of the stranger's chest, the terror of the last few hours slowly giving way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had saved her. This silent, dust-covered man. He had not asked her name. He had not asked for a reason. He had simply acted. As they rode on into the unknown, a single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a clean path through the dust and grime on her cheek. The world was reduced to the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid wall of the man's back in front of her. They rode for hours, leaving the memory of Dry Hollow to fester in the dust behind them. The flat, cracked earth gave way to rolling hills, skeletal in the moonlight, their ridges sharp against a sea of stars. Clara had never been this far from a town, never known a silence so complete. There was no drunken shouting, no tinny piano music from the saloon, only the whisper of the wind through dry grass and the soft thud of hooves. The man, her rescuer, remained a silent silhouette. He rode with an easy, ingrained confidence, his body moving with the horse as if they were one creature. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, they came to a river. It was not wide, but the water ran fast and cold over a bed of smooth stones, its voice a low murmur in the darkness. The horse stepped into the current without hesitation, and the sudden, shocking cold of the water splashing against her bare feet made Clara gasp. It was a clean, sharp sensation, a jolt that seemed to cut through the numb fog that had enveloped her mind. She felt the man's arm tighten around her waist, a steadying, impersonal pressure. He was simply keeping her from falling, nothing more. They emerged on the other side, dripping and shivering, and continued on, climbing into a landscape that grew wilder and more rugged with every mile. As the first pale hint of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, the man finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, yet it held no threat. "You're safe now." That was all he said. He did not ask who she was, where she came from, or what had happened in the town square. He did not ask about the man he had laid out in the dust. He simply stated a fact, an anchor in the swirling chaos of her life. "You're safe now." The words were so simple, so direct, that they bypassed her fear and settled somewhere deep inside her. For the first time in a very long time, she believed them. She leaned her head against his broad back, closed her eyes, and let the motion of the horse carry her away. She awoke to the sun on her face. The horse was standing still, and the world was bathed in the golden light of morning. She pushed herself upright, blinking away the sleep, and saw where he had brought her. They were at the mouth of a small, sheltered valley, a slash of impossible green tucked between stark, sun-bleached hills. A creek, likely fed by the river they had crossed, snaked through the valley floor, its banks lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves trembled in the gentle breeze. A small, sturdy ranch house, built of rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud, sat near the creek, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A barn, a corral, and a few smaller outbuildings stood nearby, and in the distance, grazing on the lush valley grass, was a small herd of wild horses, their coats shimmering in the morning sun, their manes and tails dancing in the wind. The sight was so beautiful, so peaceful, it felt like a dream. The man dismounted and then reached up for her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her body still conditioned to recoil from a man's touch, before she allowed him to lift her down. Her legs were stiff and unsteady, and she stumbled, but he caught her elbow, his grip firm and brief, releasing her the moment she found her balance. An older man emerged from the ranch house, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was wiry and weathered, with a fringe of white hair and a face so thoroughly creased with lines it looked like a map of his life. His eyes, a surprisingly sharp blue, took in the scene at a glance. The rancher, the strange woman in a torn nightgown, the story that lay between them. He did not look surprised, merely observant. "Walt," the rancher said, his voice still that same low rumble. She'll be staying for a while." The older man, Walt, nodded slowly. His gaze fell on Clara, and for the first time she did not see judgment or morbid curiosity. She saw a flicker of something that looked like compassion. "Well, she looks like she could use some coffee and a hot meal," he said, his voice raspy but kind. "Come on inside. Miss, don't you worry about a thing." Walt led her into the house. It was simple and sparsely furnished, but it was immaculately clean. The main room served as a kitchen and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a few sturdy chairs. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon. It smelled like a home. Walt pointed to a closed door. "That room in there is yours. There's clean water for washing and some clothes on the bed. They belong to my daughter, but she's long grown and gone. They might be a bit big on you, but they're clean." He then turned to the stove. "Food'll be ready when you are." Clara went into the room. It was small and contained only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. On the bed lay a simple brown dress and undergarments, neatly folded. She touched the coarse fabric of the dress. It was the plainest garment she had ever seen, yet it felt like a gift of unimaginable luxury. She washed her face and hands, the cool water a balm on her bruised skin. As she scrubbed away the grime of Dry Hollow, she felt as if she were washing away a part of her old life, a layer of shame and fear. She put on the clean clothes, and although they hung loosely on her thin frame, wearing them made her feel almost human again. When she came out, a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits was waiting for her at the table. The rancher was there, but he sat at the far end, nursing a mug of coffee, his gaze directed out the window. He did not look at her. Walt placed a cup of coffee in front of her. She murmured a thank you, her voice hoarse from disuse. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to swallow past the tightness in her throat. It was the first meal she had eaten in days that was not seasoned with fear. When she was finished, the rancher rose without a word, took his hat from a peg by the door, and went outside. Clara stayed at the table, watching him go, a silent, imposing figure against the bright morning light. The days that followed fell into a quiet, gentle rhythm. Clara healed, slowly. The angry red mark on her cheek faded to a pale yellow, then disappeared. The deeper bruises on her body ached less with each passing day, but the wounds inside her were slower to mend. She was haunted by nightmares, waking up in the dark, her heart pounding, the phantom feel of the Reverend's hand on her. During the day, she was quiet and watchful, starting at sudden noises, flinching if one of the men moved too quickly in her peripheral vision. Her rancher, the man who had brought her here, remained a distant presence. He was gone from sunup to sundown, working with the cattle or the horses. She would see him from the window, a solitary figure moving with tireless purpose across the vast landscape. He ate his meals in the same stoic silence, his presence filling the small room but never intruding upon her. He treated her with a profound and unwavering respect that was more comforting than any words could have been. He gave her space, and in that space, she began to find room to breathe. She could not bear to be idle. After a few days of simply existing, she began to help Walt with the chores. It started with small things, like sweeping the floor or washing the dishes. Then she started collecting eggs from the small chicken coop behind the house, her hands gentle as she lifted the warm, smooth shells from the nests. She found a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive tasks. They grounded her, gave her a purpose beyond merely surviving. She was not asked to do any of it. Walt would thank her with a quiet nod, and she would feel a flicker of something she had not felt in a long time: usefulness. It was a feeling born not of duty or fear, but of gratitude. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, while she was helping Walt knead bread dough, her hands dusted with flour, that she finally learned the name of the man who had saved her. "He's a good man. Cole is," Walt said conversationally, as if they were picking up a thread from a long-running dialogue. "Quiet. Carries a lot he don't talk about." Clara kept her eyes on the dough, her knuckles pressing into the soft, yielding mass. "Cole," she repeated softly, trying the name out. It felt solid, like him. Cole Merrick. "He was a scout for the Union Army, back in the war," Walt continued, his voice low. "Saw things no man should have to see, came out here after, looking for a place so quiet he could forget the sound of cannons. Found this valley, built this place with his own 2 hands. He paused, his gaze distant. He had a brother, younger, died in the fighting. I think Cole carries that more than anything." The information settled inside Clara, filling in some of the empty spaces around the silent man. Cole Merrick, a soldier, a man who knew loss. It did not explain everything, but it explained something. It explained the sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way his silence seemed not empty, but full of unspoken memories. After that, she began to watch him more closely, not out of fear, but out of a burgeoning curiosity. She watched the way he gentled a nervous colt, his voice a low, soothing murmur, his hands firm but kind. She watched the fluid, powerful grace of his movements as he split firewood, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching and releasing under his worn shirt. She watched him at night, sitting on the porch steps after dinner, staring out at the darkening valley, alone, still figure in the vastness of the wilderness. She sensed a deep well of pain in him, a mirror to her own. His silence was not a rejection of her, she began to realize, but a part of who he was, a fortress he had built around his own wounds. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, a commotion erupted from the corral. A young, half-wild horse, one Cole had recently brought down from the hills, had managed to unlatch its gate and was now tearing around the yard, its eyes wide with panic. Cole was trying to head it off, moving calmly to try and herd it back toward the open gate, but the animal was too spooked. Clara was on the porch, shaking out a tablecloth. She saw the horse bolt, heading straight for a gap in the fence that led out into the open valley. If it got out, Cole might spend days tracking it, without thinking, without considering the danger. She dropped the tablecloth and ran. She positioned herself in the gap, waving her arms, trying to make herself look bigger, to turn the horse back toward Cole. It all happened in a flash. The horse saw her and veered, its hooves churning the dirt. Cole, seeing the animal change course and head directly for her, shouted her name, or rather, a sound of alarm, as he did not know her name. He lunged, tackling her and pulling her to the ground just as the horse thundered past, its powerful body missing them by inches. They landed in a heap in the soft dust, Clara underneath him, the full weight of his body pressing her into the earth. His arms were wrapped around her in a protective clench, his breath hot against her ear. For a dizzying second, her world stopped. She was trapped beneath a man, a situation that had always meant pain and terror. A wave of panic seized her, and her body went rigid. A strangled sob caught in her throat. But this was different. His hold was not violent or possessive. It was shielding. He was protecting her. The thought was so foreign, so powerful. It cut through the rising tide of her fear. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her back, and she realized it was not just her own heart that was racing. He rolled off her almost immediately, his movements quick and tense. He got to his feet and stood over her, his face unreadable in the deepening shadows, his chest rising and falling heavily. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He just stood there, looking down at her, a strange, conflicted expression in his eyes. Clara pushed herself up, her whole body trembling, a reaction to both the fear and the sudden, unexpected intimacy of their collision. She was covered in dust. Her hair had come loose from its bun, and her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. She looked at him, at this silent, haunted man who had now saved her twice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. His jaw tightened. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the horse, which was now standing at the far end of the yard, its sides heaving. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. And without another word, without another glance in her direction, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him toward the barn, leaving her alone in the middle of the yard as the last light of day faded from the sky. She stood there for a long time, her body still trembling, her mind replaying the feeling of his arms around her, the solid weight of him, the frantic beat of his heart. He had touched her, and she had not been hurt. She had been saved, and he had walked away as if he could not bear what he had done. The silence of the valley was a fragile thing, and news from the outside world traveled like a contagion. In Dry Hollow, Clara's disappearance had ignited a firestorm of gossip and speculation. At first, there was shock, then a grim, self-righteous judgment. The preacher's wife, that quiet, haunted girl, had run off. But with whom? And why? The story mutated with each telling. She had been stolen by bandits. She had run away with a secret lover. She had simply wandered into the wilderness and perished. Reverend Josiah Tull, his jaw a swollen, purple monument to his public humiliation, did not allow the ambiguity to last. He fed the flames himself, crafting a narrative of a wayward, sinful wife lured away from her sacred vows by a dark and violent stranger. He stood in his pulpit the following Sunday, his voice trembling with a manufactured sorrow that barely concealed the venom beneath. He spoke of a wolf among his flock, a temptress in his own home, and a righteous God who demanded her return. His fury, cloaked in the language of Scripture, was absolute. He had been made a fool of, his authority challenged in the most public way imaginable, and his property had been stolen. He would have it back. He went to the sheriff, a weary, pot-bellied man named Alistair Finch, whose desire for a quiet life was constantly at odds with the town he was paid to oversee. Tull demanded a posse. Sheriff Finchon, who had been there that night and seen the raw violence of the preacher's rage, was reluctant. He had also seen the cold, efficient way the stranger had ended it. That was not a man to be trifled with. But Tull was a man of influence, and the law, however flimsy, was on his side. A wife was her husband's legal ward. Running away was tantamount to theft. With a heavy sigh, Finch agreed. A posse of half a dozen men, more bored than brave, was assembled to track down a ghost and a girl who had never truly belonged to them in the first place. Clara knew nothing of this. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of the small, sun-drenched valley. But the past was not a place one could simply ride away from. It was a stowaway, hidden in the baggage of her mind, and it emerged at night. Her sleep was fractured by vivid, terrifying nightmares. She was back in the parsonage, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and stale piety, the reverend's shadow looming over her. She was back in the town square, the faces of the crowd a pale, accusing circle in the moonlight, his hand raised to strike her again and again. She would wake with a choked cry, her body slick with a cold sweat, the patchwork quilt tangled around her like a shroud. The terror felt so real it lingered long after her eyes were open, a phantom ache in her bones. In the room next to hers, Cole Merrick would lie awake, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He heard every muffled sob, every startled gasp as she fought her unseen demons. The thin log walls of the cabin offered no barrier to her pain. Each sound was a spur in his side, a fresh indictment of the world that had broken her. A primal, protective instinct urged him to go to her, to burst through the door and offer, what, comfort? His presence would only be a fresh terror, the shape of a large man in her doorway in the middle of the night. He was the reason she was here, but he was also a stranger, a man whose capacity for violence she had already witnessed. He knew that healing, like a broken bone, had to be set and then left alone. To meddle was to risk doing more harm, so he stayed in his bed, listening, waiting for the silence to return, and the weight of his own ghosts pressed down on him in the darkness. The distance between them stretched, a silent, unbridgeable chasm. He avoided her during the day, a careful, deliberate dance of occupancy. If she was in the kitchen, he was in the barn. If she was on the porch, he was out on the range. It was a courtesy, a granting of space he felt she desperately needed, but to Clara, it began to feel like something else, a rejection, a reminder that she was an outsider, a burden he had shouldered out of a fleeting sense of duty. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating stillness of the house, she walked toward the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and horses. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the log walls, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny fairies in the air. She found Cole in one of the stalls, kneeling in the straw beside a chestnut mare. The horse was lame, favoring her front left leg, which was swollen at the joint. Cole was gently running his hands over the leg, his touch firm but incredibly tender. His voice a low, soothing rumble as he spoke to the animal. "Easy now, girl. Just gonna take a look. Won't hurt you." Clara stood in the shadows, watching. She saw in his hands, in his voice, a gentleness he never showed to people. Here was a language he was fluent in, a silent communion with a creature in pain. The mare, who should have been skittish and defensive, stood quietly under his touch, her trust absolute. Taking a breath, Clara stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward the stall. He heard her footsteps in the straw, and his body went still, his shoulders tensing. He did not look up. She knelt beside him, the rough straw pricking her knees through the fabric of her dress. She did not speak. She simply watched his hands as he finished his examination. He had a small pot of dark, strong-smelling salve, and he began to massage it into the horse's swollen joint with a slow, circular motion. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his. It was the barest of touches, her smaller, softer hand resting on the back of his, which was calloused and warm from his work. But it was like a bolt of lightning had passed between them. He froze, his fingers ceasing their movement. The horse shifted, sensing the change in him, slowly, as if it took a great and terrible effort. Cole lifted his head and turned to look at her. For the first time, they truly looked at each other. His eyes, she saw now, were a deep, clear gray, the color of a stormy sky. They were not cold, as she had first thought, but filled with a profound, weary sorrow. And in their depths, she saw a flicker of something else, something startled and vulnerable. He looked at her as if he had never really seen her before, not as the broken creature he had rescued from the dust, but as the woman kneeling beside him in the quiet, sun-dappled barn. Her own gaze did not waver. In that moment, the chasm between them vanished, replaced by a fragile, unspoken understanding. They were two solitary souls, each bearing their own invisible scars. That night, something shifted. After the simple meal of stew and cornbread, Walt, with his usual quiet perception, declared he was turning in early. Cole, instead of retreating to the porch, stayed at the table, stoking the embers in the fireplace until a small, cheerful fire danced in the hearth. He did not speak, but he did not leave. It was an invitation. Clara sat in the other chair, her hands clasped in her lap, the firelight warming her face. The silence was different now. Not a wall, but a shared space. It was she who finally broke it. "I never learned to read much," she said, her voice soft, the words a confession she had never uttered to anyone. "My mother tried to teach me before she passed, but after, my father said books were a waste of time for a girl. Cole stared into the flames, his profile a rugged landscape of light and shadow. "Ain't nothing a waste of time if it brings you peace," he said, his voice low. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought that was the end of it. But then he spoke again. "I had a brother, Thomas. He was younger than me by 2 years. He loved books, carried one with him everywhere, even in the army. Shakespeare." He'd read it out loud to the other men. Most of them couldn't make heads or tails of it, but they liked the sound of the words. He paused, and the crackle of the fire filled the silence. "He died at Cold Harbor, right next to me. He was reading from that book the night before. Said it made him feel like there was still some beauty left in the world." He fell silent again, but this time his silence was full of the brother he had lost, of the beauty that had been extinguished in the mud and blood of a battlefield. Clara's heart ached for him, for the boy with the book, for the man who had to carry that memory alone. She did not offer empty words of comfort. She simply sat with him in his grief, a silent, shared vigil. In the days that followed, the fortress around Cole Merrick began to show small cracks. He started talking to her. Not much, but more than before. He would tell her about the habits of the wild horses, or point out the track of a deer near the creek. He asked her if the clothes Walt had given her were warm enough. Small things, but they were more than she had ever expected. And in turn, Clara began to unfurl, like a flower that has been deprived of sun. One afternoon, Walt was trying to coax a stubborn hen out from under the porch, making a series of comical clucking noises that failed to impress the bird. A small, strange sound escaped Clara's lips. It was a half-chuckle, a rusty, uncertain noise. Walt stopped his clucking and looked at her. A slow, wide grin spread across his face. Cole was standing by the corral, and he turned at the sound. He saw the flicker of a genuine smile on her face, a hesitant light in her twilight eyes, and for a moment, the weary sadness in his own face lifted, replaced by something akin to wonder. The sound of her quiet laughter was more beautiful than any bird song. Their awareness of each other grew into a low, humming current that ran beneath the surface of their quiet lives. She found herself watching the way he moved, the easy, powerful grace in his stride. He found his gaze drawn to her as she hung laundry on the line, the sun catching the stray strands of her dark hair, her movements becoming less timid, more confident with each passing day. He still did not touch her, but the space between them was now charged with an unspoken tension. One night, a storm rolled in, a magnificent, violent spectacle of the plains. Lightning tore across the sky, and thunder crashed so loudly the little house seemed to shudder on its foundations. The rain came down in solid, driving sheets. Clara, who had been asleep, was jolted awake by a particularly loud clap of thunder. The storm was too much like the chaos of her past, the sudden, unpredictable violence. She sat up in bed, her body trembling uncontrollably, her heart hammering against her ribs. Unable to bear the confines of her small room, she crept out into the main living area. A single lamp was lit, and Cole was sitting at the table, cleaning a rifle, his movements calm and methodical. He looked up as she entered, and his hands stilled when he saw her. She was wrapped in a quilt, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm. He did not speak. He simply rose, walked to the fireplace, and added another log. Then he sat in one of the chairs and looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was waiting, trembling. She walked over to the other chair and sank into it, pulling the quilt tighter around herself. Another crash of thunder shook the house, and she flinched, a small cry escaping her lips. Slowly, she got up and moved to sit on the floor by his chair, drawing her knees to her chest. She wanted to be near him, near his stillness, his quiet strength. After a moment's hesitation, she leaned her head against his leg, a silent plea for comfort. He went rigid, his whole body tensing at the contact, but he did not pull away. A long minute passed, Then she felt his hand come to rest on her shoulder, his touch light, almost tentative. It was not a caress, but an anchor. He allowed her to lean on him, and they sat there in silence as the storm raged outside. Two lonely souls finding shelter in each other. The next day, the air was clean and washed, the world vibrant and new after the rain. But the memory of the night before lingered between them. The barrier of touch had been broken, and it could not be rebuilt. As he was leaving for the day, she found the courage to speak the question that had been haunting her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned, his hand on the door. "Why won't you touch me?" He looked at her, and the pain in his gray eyes was so raw it made her breath catch. "Because you deserve more than what I am," he said, his voice thick with a self-loathing that stunned her. "You're building yourself back up. You don't need a man like me, who's only ever known how to break things, tearing you down again." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving her with an answer that was more painful than his silence had ever been. They did not have long to dwell on it. A few days later, in the heat of midday, Walt spotted a plume of dust on the horizon. It was not a lone rider. It was several. Cole's body went still, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance. "Get in the house," he said to Clara, his voice flat and hard. "Stay there." There was no mistaking the look on his face. This was trouble. She did as he said, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear. She watched from the window as the riders approached. There were 6 of them, and at their head was Sheriff Finch, and right beside him, his face a thunderous mask of righteous fury, was Reverend Josiah Tull. The posse reined in their horses a few yards from the porch. Cole stood there, waiting, his stance relaxed, but his hands loose at his sides, not far from the pistol holstered at his hip. "Merrick," the sheriff said, his voice tired. "We're looking for a runaway. A woman, the wife of Reverend Tull here." "Don't know her," Cole said, his voice calm and even. Tull's face contorted with rage. "He's lying. She's here. I know she is." "This is private property, Sheriff," Cole said, his gaze never leaving Finch's face. "You have no cause to be here." "I have cause enough, Merrick," Finch replied, gesturing to Tull. "The law says a wife is her husband's responsibility. You're harboring a fugitive, by the letter of the law." He looked uneasy. He knew this was a fool's errand, but he had to see it through. "We need to search the premises." Cole didn't move. "I told you, there's no one here but me and my hired hand." "And your cousin," a voice said. The men turned. Clara was standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, but her chin was held high, and her eyes were clear and steady. She had been listening to Cole's lie, a lie he had told to protect her, and she knew, in that moment, that she could not let him face this alone. She would not hide in the shadows any longer. She stepped out onto the porch, her gaze sweeping over the men before settling on Sheriff Finch. She ignored the venomous glare from Josiah Tull. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "And Mr. Merrick is my cousin. I've been staying with him while I recover from an illness." The sheriff looked from her to Cole, his eyes full of suspicion. "An illness? That's not what the Reverend says." "The Reverend," Clara said, and now her voice was firm, imbued with a strength she did not know she possessed, "is not a truthful man." She took another step forward, into the full, harsh light of the sun. "This man," she said, gesturing to Cole, "saved my life. I was in trouble, and he helped me. I am here of my own free will, and I am not going back." Her words hung in the hot, still air. She looked directly at Tull, and for the first time, he was the one who flinched, his gaze dropping before the quiet power in hers. The men in the posse shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They had come looking for a runaway wife, a piece of property. They had not expected to find a woman who spoke with such clear, unwavering resolve. Sheriff Finch sighed, a long, weary exhalation. He looked at Clara's determined face, at Cole's dangerous stillness, and at the preacher's sputtering, impotent rage. This was a hornet's nest, and he had no desire to stir it further. Legally, he could still force the issue, but he was a man who understood the difference between the letter of the law and the heart of a matter. "All right," he said, turning his horse. "There's no runaway here. Let's go, boys." "But, Sheriff," Tull protested, his voice a strangled squawk. "She's my wife. The law—" "The lady says she's here of her own free will." "Reverend—" Finch cut him off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I'm not about to start a war over it. Let's ride." He spurred his horse, and the rest of the posse, looking relieved, followed him. Tull was the last to leave. He shot Clara a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a silent promise of future retribution, before turning his horse and galloping after the others. Clara stood on the porch, watching until they were nothing but a cloud of dust in the distance. Her body began to tremble, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak and shaky. She turned and saw Cole looking at her. The expression on his face was one she had never seen before. The distance was gone, the weary sadness replaced by a look of profound, undisguised awe. He was not looking at a victim he had rescued. He was looking at a woman who had just rescued herself. The departure of the posse left a silence in its wake that was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. The threat had been met and turned away, not by Cole's gun or his intimidating presence, but by Clara's voice. The dynamic between them had been irrevocably altered. He no longer looked at her as a fragile thing he needed to shelter, but as an equal, a woman of unexpected and formidable strength. She, in turn, no longer saw him as a mysterious, untouchable savior, but as a man who had offered her his name, even in a lie, to protect her. The quiet that settled over the valley was no longer one of avoidance, but of shared understanding. Life resumed its simple, rhythmic pace, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer a chasm of unspoken trauma, but a field of quiet possibility. A few days after the confrontation, a section of fence in the horse pasture came down during a windstorm. Cole went out to repair it, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara followed him, carrying a leather pouch of fence staples. He looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes, but he did not send her away. He simply nodded and went back to his work. They worked together under the vast, open sky, the sun warm on their backs. He would set a new post, his muscles straining as he drove it deep into the earth, and she would follow, stretching the wire taut and holding it in place while he hammered the staples home. They did not speak much, finding a comfortable rhythm in the shared labor, the rhythmic crash of the sledgehammer, the whine of the wire, the soft thud of their boots on the packed earth. It was a kind of communication in itself. It felt natural, right, as if they had been doing this for years. They were working on the final section, Cole holding the wire stretcher to pull the last bit of slack, and she was kneeling, ready with a staple and hammer. He reached down for the staple, his eyes on the wire, and his hand brushed against hers. It was a simple, accidental contact, the kind of thing that happens a dozen times a day, but in the charged stillness between them, it was monumental. His fingers, calloused and warm, grazed the back of her hand. In the past, he would have recoiled as if burned. This time, he did not. His hand lingered for a heart-stopping second, a silent acknowledgement of her presence, before he took the staple and turned back to his work. But that single, fleeting touch had changed the air again. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. It was permission, she thought. It was the sign she had been waiting for, a signal that the walls he had built around himself were finally coming down. She felt a surge of boldness, a desire to claim the fragile connection that had been growing between them. She was no longer the terrified girl from Dry Hollow. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she wanted to use it. Not with words, but with a gesture that would say everything she could not. Later that evening, after Walt had retired to his small room in the barn, they sat by the fire as they often did now. The flames cast a warm, flickering glow on their faces, creating an island of intimacy in the dark, quiet house. Cole was staring into the fire, his expression thoughtful, the earlier tension of the day having smoothed the hard lines around his eyes and mouth. Clara's resolve hardened. She would not spend the rest of her life waiting for a happiness she was too afraid to reach for. She rose from her chair and moved to stand before him. He looked up, his gray eyes questioning in the firelight. She did not give herself time to second-guess her courage. She leaned down, intending to press her lips to his, a soft, simple kiss to bridge the final gap between them. He moved with a speed that startled her. He did not push her away, but his hand came up, his fingers gently catching her chin, stopping her inches from his mouth. His touch was firm but incredibly soft. It was not a rejection, but a pause, a question. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak her name. It sounded like a prayer and a warning all at once. "Not like this," he said, his thumb stroking her jawline, a touch so tender it made her want to weep. "Not when you still flinch in your sleep." The words were a bucket of cold water, extinguishing the fire of her boldness in an instant. It was a rejection, after all, but one so gentle, so rooted in a kindness she did not understand, that it hurt more than any cruelty. He saw her not as a woman, but as a patient, a wounded bird still mending under his care. He saw the bruises that were no longer visible on her skin, but which he could still hear in her nightly terrors. The strength she had felt so fiercely just moments before crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and thick with a frustration so profound it stole her breath. It was a frustration with Tull, with her father, with the world that had made her this way. But most of all, it was a frustration with herself, with the broken parts of her that she could not seem to leave behind, the parts that even this good, quiet man could see so clearly. A sob tore from her throat, and she stumbled back, covering her face with her hands. In an instant, he was on his feet. The hesitation, the fear that had always held him back, was gone, burned away by the sight of her pain. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her against the solid wall of his chest. He just held her. For the first time, he held her not to save her from a charging horse or to steady her on her feet, but simply to hold her. His arms were strong and sure around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, his fingers tangling gently in her hair. He did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply provided a safe, solid place for her to finally break. She wept against his shirt, all the fear and humiliation and pent-up loneliness pouring out of her in a cleansing, agonizing flood, and he stood like a rock in the storm, absorbing her grief, his own heart aching with a fierce, protective tenderness he had not allowed himself to feel for anyone in a very long time. The peace that followed was fragile, like the thin crust of ice on a pond in early winter. They did not speak of what had happened, but it lay between them, a new and deeper understanding. The next day dawned bright and clear, and a semblance of their quiet routine returned. But the world had a cruel way of reminding them that safety was an illusion. It was late afternoon when he came, a lone rider, approaching not with the weary pace of a traveler, but with the reckless, urgent gallop of a man possessed. Walt, who was mending a harness on the porch, was the first to see him. "Cole!" he shouted, his voice sharp with alarm. "Rider coming in hard!" Cole emerged from the barn, his body instantly alert. Clara, who had been feeding the chickens, froze, the grain spilling from her hand, even from a distance. The rider's identity was unmistakable. It was Josiah Tull. He was alone, swaying drunkenly in the saddle, a bottle clutched in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was a man stripped of his public authority, his posse, his righteous facade. All that was left was the raw, vengeful core of his being. "Get in the barn! Clara!" Cole yelled, his voice a harsh command. "Lock the door!" For a second, she was frozen, the instinct to stand her ground warring with the primal terror that Tull's image ignited in her. But one look at the cold, deadly focus on Cole's face, and she ran. She fled to the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door just as Tull reined his horse to a skidding halt in the yard, shouting her name. "Clara, you Jezebel! You will come out of there! You belong to me!" His voice was a drunken, slurring roar. She pressed herself into the darkest corner of the barn, sinking down into the hay, her hands over her ears to block out the sound of his voice. But it seeped through, terrifying and familiar. She could hear the confrontation outside. Cole's voice was low and steady, a dangerous counterpoint to Tull's ravings. "Get off my land, Tull. Not without my wife. She is my property, bought and paid for. You will not keep her from me." "She's not your property, and she's not here. Now leave, before you get hurt." A shot rang out, deafeningly loud. Clara screamed, scrambling backward in the hay. It was followed by a crash of glass and another bellow of rage from Tull. He was firing wildly. She heard Walt's voice, sharp and commanding. Then the sound of a scuffle, a grunt of pain. The terror was a living thing inside her, cold and sharp. Suddenly, the bar on the barn door rattled. Then came a heavy, splintering crash as Tull threw his shoulder against it. Once, twice. On the third try, the wood splintered and the bar broke free. The doors swung inward with a groan, flooding the dark barn with blinding sunlight. Tull stood there, silhouetted against the light, his face a mask of sweat and fury, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "There you are," he hissed, stalking toward her. Clara scrambled backward, but she was cornered. He grabbed the front of her dress, his fingers twisting in the fabric, and hauled her to her feet. "You will learn respect," he snarled, his breath a foul wave of whiskey and hate. He began to drag her toward the door. "Let her go." The voice was as cold and sharp as ice. Cole stood at the barn doors, his feet planted, a long-barreled Colt revolver in his hand. It was not aimed, but held with a calm, deadly readiness. Walt was behind him, a shotgun held loosely in his hands, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. Tull laughed, a high, unhinged sound. He shoved Clara in front of him, using her as a shield. The muzzle of his own pistol pressed against her temple. "You'll shoot through her to get to me? Cattleman? I think not." Everything seemed to happen at once. Walt, seeing Clara in mortal danger, took a step forward, raising the shotgun. Tull, his drunken eyes darting wildly, swung his pistol away from Clara and fired at the old man. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. Walt cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and staggered backward, clutching his chest as a dark stain blossomed on his shirt. In that same instant, freed from being a shield, Clara drove her elbow back with all her strength, catching Tull in the ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Cole needed. His Colt bucked in his hand, the report sharp and clean. Tull screamed, a sound of agony this time, and collapsed to the ground, clutching a shattered shoulder, his pistol clattering away into the straw. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise. It was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Clara did not look at Tull, writhing on the ground. She ran to Walt. He had sunk to his knees just outside the barn door. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. "Walt," she whispered, her voice breaking. His blue eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. He reached up, his hand trembling, and took hers. The blood on his shirt was spreading, dark and final. "Cole!" he rasped, looking past her. "Good shot." Cole was there, kneeling on the other side, his face a mask of anguish. He had already seen the wound. It was mortal. Walt's gaze shifted back to Clara. His grip on her hand tightened. "See?" he whispered, his voice a faint, rattling breath. "I told you, you're not a frightened girl anymore." His eyes fluttered, and the light in them dimmed. The hand holding hers went limp, and then he was gone. Clara knelt there in the dust, holding the hand of the kind old man who had shown her nothing but decency. And a new kind of tears fell. Tears not of fear or frustration, but of a profound and soul-crushing loss. Cole rose, his face carved from stone. He walked over to Tull, who was moaning and incoherent with pain, and kicked the man's pistol away. He stood over him for a long, silent moment, and Clara thought he was going to kill him, but then he turned away and walked back to her. "We have to bury him," he said, his voice hollow. Then he looked at her, his eyes full of a desperate, terrible urgency. "And then you have to leave. Clara, you see what he brings. You see what he's done. I can't keep you safe here. You have to go." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust. She looked at the body of their friend, at the broken barn door, at the wounded, pathetic man who had brought this ruin upon them. And she felt not fear, but a cold, hard certainty. She had been running her whole life, from her father, from Tull, from the whispers and the pity. She was done running. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "This is my home now. I won't run from evil again. I'm staying." He looked at her, ready to argue, but he saw the resolve in her eyes, a reflection of the strength he had seen when she faced down the posse. It was a strength forged in fire and loss, and it was absolute. He could no more order her to leave than he could command the sun to set. Together, in the fading light of the afternoon, they carried Walt's body to a lone cottonwood tree that stood on a small rise overlooking the valley. They took turns digging the grave in the hard, rocky soil, their movements synchronized, their shared grief a silent, binding force between them. When it was done, they stood side by side, two solitary figures under the vast, indifferent sky, and said their goodbyes to the man who had been their friend. They had buried a part of their past, and in doing so, had planted the seeds of a shared, uncertain future. The death of Walt left a hollow space in the center of their lives. The small ranch, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed vast and empty, its silence filled with the ghost of his gruff kindness and the echo of his easy wisdom. The burden of his absence fell upon them both, a shared weight that forced them into a new and necessary partnership. There was no one else to mend the harnesses, to tend the fire, to see to the 100 small tasks that keep a life from unraveling. They had to rely on each other. Out of this shared grief, Clara bloomed. She did not allow herself to be consumed by the loss. Instead, she used it as fuel. She had made her stand. She had refused to run. And now she would prove her worth, not to Cole, but to herself. She found Walt's old ledger in a dusty crate beneath his cot. The pages were filled with his spidery, utilitarian script, a meticulous accounting of every calf born, every sack of flour purchased, every dollar earned from the sale of a horse. At first, the numbers and notes were a foreign language, but she dedicated herself to deciphering them. She would sit at the table late into the night, a single lamp burning, tracing the lines with her finger, teaching herself the arithmetic of survival. For the first time in her life, she felt a sense of control, a feeling of mastery over her own destiny that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. She was no longer content to be a passenger in her own life. She had watched Cole with the horses, had seen the quiet, intuitive way he moved among them. She asked him to teach her to ride properly, not just to sit on a horse, But to truly ride it, he was a patient teacher. He chose a calm, steady-eyed mare for her and showed her how to saddle and bridle the animal, his large hands guiding hers until the movements became familiar. At first, she was timid, her body stiff with the remembered fear of being powerless. But day by day, her confidence grew. She learned to feel the rhythm of the horse beneath her, to move with it, to guide it with a gentle pressure of her knees and a soft touch on the reins. Soon, she was galloping across the valley, the wind tearing at her hair, a feeling of wild, exhilarating freedom surging through her. She was not running from anything, she was running toward herself. Her transformation did not stop there. The memory of Tull's pistol, the sound of the shot that had killed Walt, was a constant low hum of fear in the back of her mind. She would not be helpless again. One afternoon, she found Cole cleaning his revolver on the porch. She stood before him, her hands clasped, and said, "Teach me." He looked up, his hands stilling on the oiled metal of the gun. He saw the grim determination in her eyes and knew this was not a whim. It was a necessity. He took her out to the far end of the pasture, away from the house and the livestock, and set up a row of tin cans on a fence post. The first time she held the Colt, its weight surprised her. It was a heavy, solid, deadly thing. The first time she fired it, the recoil jolted through her arm, and the blast made her flinch, her ears ringing. She missed the cans entirely, but she did not give up. Cole stood behind her, his voice a low, steady presence. "Don't fight it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Breathe out as you fire." He adjusted her stance, his hands briefly on her shoulders, a touch that was purely instructional, yet it sent a tremor through her. She practiced every day, the loud report of the gun echoing through the quiet valley. Her flinch lessened, her aim steadied. The day she hit all 3 cans in a row, a slow, proud smile spread across her face. Cole just nodded, but she saw the admiration in his eyes. He was watching her forge herself into a woman of the frontier, a woman who could stand on her own. When the traveling traders came, a monthly visit to supply the isolated ranches with goods, Cole saw the final piece of her transformation fall into place. The lead trader, a gruff, portly man named Silas, was used to dealing with Walt or Cole. He tipped his hat to Clara but directed his business talk to Cole, his voice booming. "Merrick, got that barbed wire you were after? Price has gone up. I'm afraid, hard times." Before the Cole could respond, Clara stepped forward, Walt's ledger held in her hand. "The price you quoted, mister. Merrick last month was $2 a roll." "Silas," she said, her voice clear and firm. "And according to my books, you sold it to the Miller Ranch downriver for $1.75 just last week. We'll take 3 rolls, at the Miller's price." Silas was so taken aback he could only stammer. He looked at Cole, expecting him to intervene, to put this woman in her place. Cole leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. He said nothing. All the authority was Clara's. After a moment of blustering, Silas, defeated, agreed to her price. As the traders packed up to leave, he tipped his hat to her again, this time with a genuine, if grudging, respect. Clara had not just managed the books. She had become the mistress of the ranch. Cole watched all of this with a quiet, growing sense of wonder. The woman he had rescued was disappearing, and in her place was this capable, confident person who moved with purpose and spoke with an authority that came from within. He found himself seeking out her company, the quiet evenings by the fire becoming the part of the day he looked forward to the most. And as his admiration grew, the walls around his own heart began to crumble. He started to talk, not about the weather or the cattle, but about the things he had locked away in the deepest part of himself. He told her more about his brother, Thomas, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw after all these years. He spoke of the guilt he carried, of being the older brother who was supposed to protect him. "He died in my arms," Cole said one night, his voice barely a whisper as he stared into the flames. He was so scared, not of dying, but of being forgotten. He made me promise I would live enough for the both of us. He shook his head, a bitter, self-deprecating motion. I came out here to hide. I haven't lived at all. He told her about the family he had lost even before the war, a fever that had swept through their small Ohio farm and taken his parents and a younger sister in the space of a week. He spoke of being adrift, of joining the army because he had nowhere else to go. He laid the broken pieces of his past at her feet, a testament to the trust she had earned. Clara listened, her heart aching for him, and she understood that his silence had not been a rejection of her, but a shield for his own shattered soul. A late autumn storm brought them to a precipice. They had been out on the range, a full day's ride from the ranch, checking on a remote section of fence line, when the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The rain started as a drizzle, then quickly became a cold, driving downpour. They were soaked to the bone within minutes, the wind whipping at them with a relentless fury. They worked for hours, their hands numb, their bodies shivering, to repair the broken fence before the cattle could wander out onto the open plains. They rode back in the dark, the horses exhausted, the rain still falling. When they finally stumbled into the house, they were shivering so violently they could barely speak. They stripped off their wet outer clothes and huddled by the fireplace, wrapped in dry blankets. While the storm raged outside, there was no question of retreating to their separate, cold rooms. The fire was the only source of life and warmth in the house. They sat side by side on a makeshift bed of blankets and quilts on the floor, so close their shoulders touched. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. The shared hardship, the bone-deep exhaustion, had stripped away their final defenses. In the warm, flickering light, they were just a man and a woman, finding shelter together. Clara turned to look at him. His hair was damp, and the firelight carved deep shadows into the lines of his weary face. The pain she had seen in him was still there, but it was softer now, tempered by a vulnerability he no longer tried to hide. She felt a wave of love for him so powerful it was a physical ache in her chest. This time, when she leaned in, there was no hesitation. Her movements were slow, firm, and certain. She placed her hand on his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough stubble on his jaw, and pressed her lips to his. He froze for a moment, a lifetime of restraint warring with a decade of loneliness. His lips were soft, hesitant under hers. She felt him begin to pull back, and she broke the kiss, her forehead resting against his. "Cole," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. He opened his eyes, and she looked directly into their stormy gray depths. "I want to be touched like a woman, not a victim." Her words were the key that unlocked the final door. He looked at her, truly saw her, the strength in her eyes, the certainty in her touch, and the last of his hesitation vanished. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch both tender and desperate, and kissed her again. It was a kiss of profound, shattering release. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke, of loneliness and longing, of two broken souls finding their way back to wholeness in each other. It deepened, becoming more urgent, a desperate, silent conversation of all the things they had never been able to say. He laid her back gently onto the pile of quilts, his body covering hers, his eyes never leaving her face. Their lovemaking was a storm of its own, as tender and as desperate as their first kiss. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of herself, a discovery of a pleasure and an intimacy she had never known, an act not of submission, but of joyous, powerful union. For Cole, it was a reawakening, a painful and beautiful return to a part of himself he thought had died on the battlefield with his brother. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the warm cocoon of the blankets, the fire dying down to glowing embers, a single, soft sob escaped Clara's lips. It was not a cry of pain or sadness, but of a release so complete it had to find its way out. Cole gathered her closer, his arms a safe harbor. He held her, stroking her hair, until the quiet weeping subsided. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Neither of us do." The days that followed were filled with a quiet, unassuming warmth. A new and gentle intimacy settled between them, as comfortable and as necessary as the rising of the sun. Clara found a patch of good soil near the creek and started a small garden, turning the earth and planting seeds for the spring, putting down roots in the truest sense of the word. She began to sing as she worked, her voice soft and clear as she washed clothes or kneaded bread. Cole found himself smiling more often, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and erased some of the weariness that had lived there for so long. The hollow space in their lives was beginning to fill, not with a replacement for what they had lost, but with the green, vibrant shoots of something new. One day, a rider from a neighboring ranch stopped by on his way back from Dry Hollow. He brought them supplies and a single, sealed letter addressed to Cole. It was from Sheriff Finch. Cole opened it, his face grim, and read it in silence. "What is it?" Clara asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. He looked up from the page, his expression unreadable. "It's about Tull," he said. "He's dead." Clara felt a wave of dizziness, and she put a hand on the table to steady herself. The letter explained, in Finch's terse official language, that Josiah Tull, in a drunken rage, had started a fight in the saloon over a card game. A man had pulled a knife. It had all been over in a matter of seconds. The news did not bring her joy, or even satisfaction. It brought only a profound, shuddering relief. It was the sound of a final chain breaking, the last grip of her past releasing its hold. The ghost that had haunted her was finally gone. That night, Cole asked her the question that had been lying unspoken between them. "Now that he's gone," he said, his voice quiet, "you could leave, go back to a town, start a new life, a proper one." She looked at him, at this good, quiet man who had offered her shelter and then, unexpectedly, his heart. She looked around the small, simple room that had become her sanctuary, at the fire that had warmed her, at the windows that looked out onto the valley that had healed her. "I am home, Cole," she said softly, leaving no room for doubt. "This is my home now, if you still want me." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. A slow smile spread across his face, the smile she had come to cherish. "Clara," he said, his voice full of a feeling she could finally put a name to. It was love. "I never asked your name because when I brought you here, you were running from a man who thought he owned you. A name felt like another claim, another brand. I didn't want to own you." He squeezed her hand, his gray eyes locking with hers. "But now I want to build something with you." The fragile piece they had built was as delicate and as beautiful as a spider's web at dawn. With the death of Josiah Tull, the last great shadow of Clara's past had receded, and in its place, a quiet, hopeful future began to take root. Spring came to the valley, painting the hillsides with the tender green of new grass and the vibrant colors of wildflowers. The small garden Clara had planted began to sprout, its neat rows a testament to her faith in the seasons. Their life together settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet affection. They were two solitary people who, in finding each other, had discovered they were not meant to be alone. The ranch, once a place of refuge, had become a home, its foundations built not of logs and mud, but of mutual respect and a love that needed few words. But in the harsh lands of the frontier, envy was a weed that grew even in the most barren soil, while Cole's Valley flourished, blessed with a creek that never ran dry. The surrounding ranches baked under a relentless sun. The other ranchers, men who had scratched a hard living from the unforgiving earth, began to look at Cole's green paradise with greedy eyes. Among them was a man named Jedediah Thorne, a cattle baron with a vast herd and an even vaster ambition. He saw Cole's land not as a home, but as a resource, water and grazing land that he believed was wasted on a reclusive former scout and the woman of questionable reputation who lived with him. The whispers started in Dry Hollow, a town that had never forgotten the spectacle of Clara's arrival or the preacher's demise. The story of her past was resurrected and twisted into a malicious new shape. She was no longer a victim who had escaped a brutal husband. In this new telling, she was a cunning seductress, a runaway of loose morals who had bewitched the solitary rancher, Cole Merrick, with her feminine wiles. The death of the preacher was spun as a convenient accident that freed her to complete her scheme. She had bewitched him. The talk went to steal his land, a prize far greater than any a woman like her could ever hope to attain honestly. The poison of the rumors spread from the saloons to the general stores, carried by men like Thorne who saw an opportunity to use public opinion as a weapon. The trouble, when it came, arrived not with the fury of a drunken preacher, but with the cold, dispassionate authority of the law. Sheriff Alastair Finch rode into the valley one afternoon, not with a posse, but alone, his face grim, a folded legal document in his hand. "Cole, Clara," he said, dismounting and avoiding their eyes. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of this. It's a summons." Cole took the paper, his face hardening as he read it. "What is this, Alastair? A challenge to my land claim?" "Thorne and a few others have filed a petition with the circuit judge," the sheriff explained, his voice heavy with reluctance. "They're claiming your original filing was improper. Something about the survey markers. It's a flimsy pretext. Cole, and we both know it. The real issue is her." He gestured awkwardly toward Clara. "They're using her past, her association with Tull, to argue that you're of unsound mind, that you've been unduly influenced. They're calling her character into question and using it to challenge your right to the land." A cold, dangerous rage began to build in Cole's eyes. "They have no right." "Maybe not," Finch conceded. "But the judge has agreed to hear the case. It's a formal hearing, a trial of sorts, in 3 days, in Dry Hollow." He finally looked at Clara, his expression one of genuine pity. "I'm sorry, miss, they mean to drag your name through the mud to get what they want." After the sheriff had gone, a tense, angry silence filled the small cabin. Cole paced the floor like a caged wolf, his hands clenched into fists. "You will not go," he said, his voice a low, protective growl. "I will handle this. Thorne wants a fight. I'll give him one. But I will not have him and his cronies staring at you, whispering about you. I will not put you through that." Clara stood by the window, watching the creek flow, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had thought she was free, but the past had a longer reach than she had ever imagined. She turned to face him, her expression calm, but her eyes burning with a fierce, unshakable resolve. "You will not handle this, Cole," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not alone. This is not about survey markers. This is about me. They are using my name, my story, as their weapon. Do you think I can hide here while they tear me to pieces in a public square? Do you think I can live with the shame of that? I did that once. I hid in this valley while you faced a posse for me. I will not do it again." "Clara, it's too dangerous," he pleaded, his anger giving way to a desperate fear for her. "They're vicious men. They will say terrible things." "Let them," she said, her chin lifting. "I have lived through terrible things. Cole, I am not afraid of words. The only thing I am afraid of is becoming that silent, frightened girl again. The girl who let other people decide her fate. I have to face them. Not for the land, not for you, for me. I will not be a ghost in my own life." He looked at her, at the formidable strength that seemed to radiate from her small frame, and he knew he could no more stop her than he could stop the river from flowing to the sea. He saw that this was not just a legal battle. It was the final, necessary act of her own liberation. He walked to her and took her hands in his grip tight and steady. "All right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We will face them together." The journey back to Dry Hollow was a grim pilgrimage. The town, when they rode in, seemed both a lifetime away and terrifyingly familiar. The same dust, the same heat, the same splintered storefronts. But this time, Clara was not a captive. She rode beside Cole, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares and the sudden, hushed whispers that followed them down the main street. They were an army of two, marching into enemy territory. The hearing was held in the saloon, the largest building in town. The gambling tables had been pushed to the walls, and rows of benches had been brought in to face a makeshift judge's bench set up on the stage where a tinny piano usually played. The room was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and morbid curiosity. At the front sat Jedediah Thorne and his lawyer, a smug, rat-faced man from a bigger city. The circuit judge, a man named Elias Harrison, was a stern, white-haired man with eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul. He called the room to order with a bang of his gavel, and the proceedings began. Thorne's lawyer laid out their case with a sneering, theatrical flourish. He spoke of the questionable survey, but quickly moved to his real target. He painted a lurid picture of Clara, calling her a woman of ill repute, a temptress who had fled her pious husband and latched onto a lonely, vulnerable rancher. He twisted her tragedy into a sordid tale of ambition and deceit. He implied that she had driven the Reverend to his grave with her wicked ways, and had now bewitched Cole Merrick with the sole purpose of stealing his valuable land. Clara sat beside Cole, her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the vile caricature they made of her life. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral, even as every word felt like a fresh lash against her skin. Cole's hand rested on her arm, a silent, grounding pressure, his body radiating a tightly controlled fury. When the lawyer was finished, Judge Harrison turned his sharp gaze on them. "Mr. Merrick, do you or your associate wish to respond to these allegations?" Cole started to rise, but Clara put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "I will speak, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady in the suddenly silent room. She walked to the front of the room and stood before the judge's bench, turning so that she could face not just him, but the entire town. She stood alone, a small, solitary figure in a simple brown dress, and she began to speak. "My name is Clara Sutton," she began, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the crowded room. "And I am not the woman that lawyer has described, but I understand why you might believe him. You have only ever seen pieces of my story. You have only ever heard the whispers. Today, I will tell you the truth." She told them everything. She spoke of her father, a man broken by drink and despair, and the gambling debt he could not pay. She spoke of being sold, a piece of property traded to settle a ledger. She described her wedding day, standing in this town's church in a dusty white dress, her heart a cold, dead thing in her chest. "I became the wife of your Reverend," she said, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd. "A man you respected, a man who preached to you of sin and salvation on Sundays. You saw him as a man of God. I knew him as a man of cruelty. You saw a pious husband burdened by a silent, melancholic wife. I knew a violent man whose righteousness was fueled by the whiskey he drank in secret." A murmur went through the crowd. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet, unadorned truth was more powerful than any shouted accusation. "You saw me walk to the well every morning. You saw me in the street. You whispered about the sadness in my eyes. You whispered about my bruises when you thought I could not hear, but none of you ever spoke to me. None of you ever asked if I needed help. You turned a blind eye, because it was easier. It was not your business." She paused, letting the weight of their complicity settle in the stuffy room. "The night I left this town, I was not running away with a lover. I was being dragged into the town square by a drunken man who intended to beat me in front of all of you. And you gathered to watch. You stood and you watched, until a stranger, a man who did not even know my name, showed more courage and decency than this entire town combined. He saved my life. Cole Merrick did not bewitch me. He did not steal me. He offered me safety when no one else would. He treated me with quiet dignity. And that is the truth of it. She fell silent. The room was utterly still. No one moved. No one whispered. For the first time, they had been forced to see her, not as the preacher's strange wife, but as a human being. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke out. "She's telling the truth." All heads turned. An elderly woman, Martha, the blacksmith's wife, was slowly getting to her feet, her hands trembling. She had been one of the whisperers, one of the silent watchers. "I remember her wedding day," Martha said, her voice shaking but clear. "I was there. I saw her face. No bride should look that empty." It wasn't the look of a woman starting a new life. It was the look of a soul being buried alive. She looked at Clara, her eyes full of a long overdue compassion. We all saw it. We just chose not to. The old woman's testimony was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples spreading through the crowd, shattering the foundation of Thorne's lies. Judge Harrison looked at Thorne, his expression one of withering contempt. Then he looked at Clara, and his stern face softened with respect. He banged his gavel, the sound a final, decisive crack. "The petition to challenge the land claim of Mr. Cole Merrick is dismissed, with prejudice," he declared, his voice booming. "It is a frivolous and malicious action, born of greed and slander. As for you, miss," he said, looking directly at Clara, "this court recognizes you as a woman of courage and unimpeachable character. Your name is cleared." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Clara. It was over. The last ghost had been faced and vanquished in the light of day. As she walked back to her seat, the crowd parted for her, their faces no longer filled with suspicion, but with a new, dawning respect. They rode out of Dry Hollow in the golden light of the late afternoon. The silence on the journey home was not tense or uncertain, but filled with a deep and abiding peace. They had faced the world together and won. That evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills, painting the valley in hues of rose and gold. Cole turned to her, his gray eyes full of a love so deep it left her breathless. He had never spoken the words, but she saw them in his gaze every day. "The judge called you Clara Sutton," he said, his voice soft. "I realize today, after all this time, I still don't know. What is your full name?" A slow, radiant smile spread across Clara's face. She looked at him, at this man who had never asked for anything but had given her everything. "It's Clara Sutton Merrick," she answered, her voice full of a joyous certainty. "If you'll have me." He did not need to answer. He simply pulled her into his arms and kissed her. A kiss that held the promise of a lifetime of sunrises over their valley. They were married a week later, under the lone cottonwood tree where Walt was buried. It was not a church, but it was a sacred place, a place of loss and new beginnings. The sky was their cathedral, the wind in the leaves their choir. Clara wore a simple dress the color of a clear blue sky, and in her hair, she had woven a sprig of wildflowers from her garden. Cole stood before her, his eyes full of a happiness she had never thought she would see. And they spoke their vows to each other, promises not of ownership, but of partnership. The story ends not in that quiet, sacred moment, but a few days later, it ends with Clara on horseback, riding out across the plains beside her husband. Her seat is sure, her hands steady on the reins. A smile plays on her lips, a genuine, easy smile that reaches her eyes. The wind whips through her hair, and she lifts her face to the sun, strong, free, and finally, truly home. I was once sold, once silenced, but he never asked for anything, and that's why I gave him everything. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.